All right. Thank you so much for joining us. We see folks from Nevada, right here in San Francisco, a couple different neighborhoods. We have Athens, Georgia. Fantastic. We have Pasadena. We have Springville, California. So nice to see. We have some folks from around local and beyond. Thanks for joining us. I'm really happy to be welcoming you all today. My name is Jessa Barzilay. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement at San Francisco Botanical Garden. And I'm so excited to go on this walk with Dr. Nagalingum tonight. I hope you guys are as well. The Botanical Garden has the pleasure of being one of a couple hosts here tonight. We will have our chat window open for you all to ask questions throughout the event. The Q&A feature is also on. We will reserve our answers to your questions to the end of Dr. Nagalingum's presentation. But please continue to pop them in as they come up in your head. We just all really hope that this presentation tonight inspires you to take a trip, whether it's an international trip to Australia or a bike ride to the Botanical Garden or a quick stop in the Conservatory of Flowers, to immerse yourself in plants. And hopefully this taste of Australia's wonderful flora has you running out to see us sometime soon. It is my next pleasure to pass the mic to Sarah Sawtelle at the Conservatory of Flowers to introduce our speaker tonight.
Hello and good evening, everyone. It's so great to have you all here. And yes, I'm Sarah Sawtelle from the Conservatory of Flowers, where I'm the Manager of Engagement. I'm so glad you could all join us, and I'm especially glad that Natalie could join us here tonight. I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Nathalie Nagalingum, who investigates the evolution and diversification of plants with a focus on cycads. These cone-bearing palm-like plants comprise the most endangered group of plants on Earth, or organisms on Earth, in fact, not just plants. Nagalingum's research delves into the genetic diversity of these ancient seed plants in order to guide conservation priorities, ensuring that the species most under threat in the wild are prioritized in the world's botanic gardens and in their natural habitat. She serves as the Associate Curator and McAllister Chair of Botany at the California Academy of Sciences, where she oversees the institution's botany collection and regularly shares her research with the visiting public. Nagalingum worked at the Royal Botanic Garden in Sydney and received her PhD in paleobotany from the University of Melbourne. Her field research brings her across the globe, from the outback of Australia to the rainforests of Malaysia. And so tonight, I think we're headed to Australia. And thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Nagalingum, and we're delighted to have you here. And you mentioned earlier that we're going to be seeing some particularly strange flowers, some really unique plants. So I'm very much looking forward to that, and I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you. Oops, I went to the next slide. Thank you both Sarah and Jessa, and thank you to the Conservatory of Flowers and San Francisco Botanical Garden for arranging everything tonight. I'm really excited to be talking to you all. As you can tell, I have an Australian accent, and so I grew up in Australia and have kind of moved between the US and Australia for the past almost 20 years now. But I've been at the Cal Academy for about 4 years. And so tonight I want to talk to you about some adventures in Sydney. Almost all of us haven't been able to travel. And so I wanted to take you all to a virtual trip all across the world, all the way to Australia and Sydney in particular. And so before I start, I wanted to acknowledge the Aboriginal people who were the first to be on the land in Australia. And they safeguarded the flora and fauna. And unfortunately, we have not done a great job in continuing what they've done. But they comprise a really diverse group of what are called language groups. And so this map, you can see all the different colours. And so Sydney's around here. And so it's largely the Gadigal people who lived in Sydney. But you can see all across Australia, there are multiple language groups, and they have different cultures, they have different languages, different practices, and even the language can be so different that different regions, people from different regions may not even understand each other. So the Australian Aborigines are not just one homogeneous group, but many, many diverse groups. And so today, Australia politically is divided into these states. I'm from Melbourne, which is all the way down here. It's at the southeast of the mainland. And so here's my flag. And I've got another flag to show you where Sydney is. This is quite a long distance to travel from Melbourne to Sydney. It's about 14 hours driving, I think. I've done this a couple of times. And so what we would do is like stop sort of near Canberra overnight and then continue the drive to Sydney. So there's actually a rivalry between Melbourne and Sydney. And so I lived in Sydney. As Sarah said, I worked at the Botanic Gardens. And when I would go home to Melbourne, people would be like, do you really like Sydney? You know, Melbourne is much better than Sydney. Don't you want to live in Melbourne? And I loved living in Sydney. It's a beautiful place. And this slide gives you an idea of how beautiful it actually is. And so that's the Botanic Gardens over here. Of course, the Opera House. This is the downtown, the ferries, and of course, the iconic Harbour Bridge. And so Sydney is based around this like Sydney Harbour. And so you might have seen the Harbour Bridge and all the fireworks. And so that's also based, that's for the new year. And that's also based around the harbour as well. Outside of Sydney and pretty close to Sydney are many national parks, lots of bushland. This is actually called America Bay in Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park. You can see the incredible water and all the eucalyptus trees. We call them gum trees. Here's another region called Palm Beach. And for any of you who are into Australian soaps, this is where Home and Away is filmed. I've been on a bushwalk around here and the beaches are beautiful. You can see there are people packed along the beach. And as Sarah mentioned, I work on cycads and they're a particularly endangered group. One of the species or one of the genera that actually I don't work on, but that occur in the Sydney region is Macrosamia. So of course I had to like slip in a cycad in this presentation. So Sydney's bushland, you know, the flowers are not particularly obvious. Here's a picture of a eucalyptus and various other plants and ferns in the foreground. But you really need to take a really kind of closer look at the bush just to see all these mostly tiny little flowers. It's kind of like California. When you go out, you've really got to look a bit closely to see some of these flowers. However, that said, one of the most obvious plants and it's kind of flower, this is actually a bunch of tiny little flowers, is the Banksia. And so this is two different species of Banksia. And you can see their leaves are very, very different. So you've got these big sort of like leathery, tough leaves, and then these are kind of more delicate. When these inflorescences or flower heads get pollinated, this is what they look like. It's kind of crazy. These are the parts of the flower that have remained. And then these pods here, they are where the seeds are. So this is just the flower, individual flowers that have actually gotten pollinated. And in many cases, they're called follicles. They will only open once there's a bushfire. I'm not particularly sure about this species, but in many species of Australian plants, you need a bushfire to open these woody structures. And so that's why bushfires are really important in the Australian flora, but it has to be balanced against these, the intensity of the fire as well. And so we do things like control burns to make sure the bush gets regenerated. And that's in the family Proteaceae. a relative of the Banksia, also in the Proteaceae family, excuse me, is the Conospermum. It's also called smoke bush because if you look at it in the distance, it looks like a blue kind of grey smoky haze. And I think this is particularly beautiful. Another member of the Proteaceae is Grevillea, and we have a lot of Grevillea growing in gardens in the Bay Area. This is the Grevillea buxifolia, and it's called the grey spider flower. And it's not too hard to see why it's called the grey spider flower, with the kind of hairy flowers and kind of looking a little bit like a spider in the distance. Again, also part of Proteaceae. Another beautiful flower, which is very iconic of Australia, and it's also on our coat of arms, is the acacias. There are many, many species of acacias in Australia. And if you see the Australian, any team, like, as in the Olympics coming up, or there's been the soccer recently, the colours of the people, or the sports, the team members, their kits are green and gold. And so this is a really iconic colour combination for the Australian plants, for Australia. Another family which is found in Australia is the pea family. It's called the Fabaceae, and this is called Pulsineau Stipularis. It's called the fine leaf bush pea. And if you have a look at these leaves, you can see why it's common. The common name is fine leaf bush pea. All peas have this common structure where you have these this one sort of petal at the back, and you have these fused petals at the front. And if you look at your sweet peas that are growing in your garden, you'll find the same structure as well. So I think, and that's a key characteristic of the Fabaceae, or the pea family. Now to go on to the plants that we call monocots. So we have kind of a group of plants called monocots. When you look at their seeds, when they germinate, they only produce one leaf. So it's one cotyledon. And so there are a bunch of monocots in the Sydney region. This is Panasonia Occidentalis. It is a beautiful native iris, and you would have seen this in the ads for this actual talk. We have orchids, a range of orchids. I don't even know the names of this, so I'll just call this orchid. It's really, I mean, this is really stunning. And again, you can see how I had to get really close, and this is the leaf litter. So these are really, really tiny plants. So you've got to like look really closely, walk really slowly during your bushwalk to make sure you spot them. Here's another orchid as well. Again, really beautiful. What happens is that the insect will fly into this region. It gets what is called a pollenia. It's an aggregation of pollen that sits, it actually gets sort of trapped on or stuck onto its back. And then when it goes to the next flower, that pollenia is going to be deposited on the female structure. This is a beautiful one, Apachris Longafolia. It's actually related to the heath. It's in the heath family. For a long time, these were in their own family called Apachridaceae, but with molecular work, so DNA work, we realised that it's part of the heath family, and so they've all been transferred to the heaths, and the heaths that occur here in the Northern Hemisphere. And it's not hard to see why this is called the fuchsia heath. And in this case, you've got these flowers where the petals are what we call fused, and you can see that like these are the little female structures that are poking out. Another family in the Sydney area and all across Australia is the Rutaceae, which is the citrus family. This is what we call the Baronia, and this particular species is Sydney Baronia. Also in this family is Philotheca myoporides, and this is called the box leaf wax flower. So there's a bunch of species in Philotheca that are called wax flowers, and they kind of look kind of waxy. And so that's why they get that name. A couple of fun plants that you can see in Sydney, which are carnivorous, is Drosera, and this is called the common sundew. And the way this traps insects is that the insects will come to get the nectar on the top of these little trichomes or hairs, and then it triggers the leaf to actually curl over and trap the insect. And here you can see this insect here, probably a fly, has been captured by the sundew, so by this process. And so this is pretty poor soil. And so the way it gets the nutrients is through catching these insects. And the last one I want to show you is this pretty fascinating flower called Tricularia Uniflora. It is really pretty. It's really, really, really tiny. You can see my fingernail here. And so it's a really small plant. So again, one of those ones you really have to go and look for. And so this is it is an aquatic plant. And if you look sort of underground, what you'll see is that there's little bladders or little sort of sacs, I guess. And so what happens is that little invertebrates in the water will approach that sac or that bladder, and they get sucked in. And so they get sucked in and then they just get digested. And so this is the way that the bladderwort gets its nutrients too. And so with that, quick view of some really pretty flowers and unusual flowers in Sydney. We're going to say goodbye to Sydney and head over to San Francisco, our home, and in particular to the San Francisco Botanical Garden. And I want to take you through a few plants that you saw in the earlier images from Sydney and show you a little bit about their flower morphology and hopefully tempt you to come and visit the Conservatory of Flowers and San Francisco Botanic Gardens. And so just a little explanation about flower structure. So what we have is all of the parts of the flower have been kind of extended and separated in this image. So you can see all of the different parts. And so what we have is what we consider the female parts, and the ovary is where the eggs are, and that's what gets pollinated by the pollen. And so we have the stigma, which is the area where pollen lands. So it's often called, an easy way to remember it is sticky stigma. And so they're often sticky to help pollen adhere to it. And what happens is the pollen will grow down the style, so that the style is between the ovary and the stigma. It'll grow down and fertilize the eggs. The male parts, and so I've got these symbols here to indicate which is female and which is male. So we have the filament and we have the anther, and collectively they're called the stamen. Another part of the flower, which is not related to male or female parts, but is usually used to attract pollinators, in some cases, not all cases, is the petals. We have the sepals, which is the outer whorl, and it usually protects the flower bud as it's growing. And we have the receptacle, which everything kind of clings onto, and the pedicel, which is just basically the base. And so one of the families that is really common in Australia is Proteaceae. And we have many examples of Proteaceae growing in the Bay Area, and they're also in flower arrangements. My friend Rebecca gave me a beautiful flower bouquet the other day with a bunch of Proteaceae in it. So I was really happy to get that. And so what I've got are some images of Proteaceae, but these are actually South African. So I showed you some of the Australian ones before, but these are the South African ones. You've probably seen these ones actually these are all from San Francisco Botanic Garden. And this one, the leucospermum, you've seen in flower bouquets. This is the king Protea, and this is what the family is named after. And Protea was the god of the sea, and he in Greek mythology took on many different forms. And so what we're looking at in Proteaceae is what we call these flower heads, and they're made up of many, many small individual flowers. Sometimes there can be like 500 flowers, depending on the species. Flowers are really weird. And I remember when I was learning about it in undergrad, I had really struggled with what was going on. And so I didn't do very well in that, in one of the practical exams, because we had to draw a flower and I didn't really know how those structures worked, but now I do. And so these plants, Proteaceae, are mostly in Australia and South Africa, as I mentioned, but they're also found elsewhere in the Southern Hemisphere. So it's a predominantly Southern Hemisphere family. And so what I want to do is show you some images of what the flower structure looks like. So next time you're at the Botanic Garden or at the florist, you can have a look and see what is actually going on. And so this is like the first stage here. Actually, this image is a photograph I took just today of my textbook from undergrad. And so it's not a very great photograph, but the illustrations are really great. And so what you see here is the style, and it's actually in with the anthers. So the style is the female part and the anthers have the male part, so the pollen. And then, so this is a kind of immature flower. And then as it develops, this style actually pops out. And you can see here the anthers are like separating and the style comes out. And what we have here is the pollen presenter. And so the pollen presenter, because the style, the pollen presenter was in amongst the anthers, it actually got the pollen all over it. And then when it opens or sort of unfurls from that aggregation of anthers, it actually presents the pollen to the pollinators. And in many cases, those are birds. And so the birds end up getting them all over their heads. And just another look at it, this is one I just got off online. What you see is that as the flower matures, the pollen presenter becomes the stigma, which is kind of crazy. Now you can see why I kind of struggled with this. So we have the style and the pollen presenter is now the stigma. So we have female parts. And these are the anthers. And this stigma only starts to become receptive. So it only starts to collect pollen once that pollen in this flower has basically disappeared. And so it ensures that we don't get self-pollination. And then, so what we have when we have the fruit, and this is what we call the fruit, because it's been pollinated and produced seeds, is we have the styles here. They all kind of just stick around. And then we have the follicle, which is unopened, and this is an open follicle, and you can see the seed in it. And so some pictures from the San Francisco Botanic Garden. This is, now you can look at it and actually see there are individual flowers in here. And so in this case, what's happened is that we have the pollen presenter still curled up, you see, in the anthers, and a few at the very top that are starting to pop out and actually present the pollen. And so this is a little bit clearer, where you can see all of the pollen presenters in with the anthers, and the style is this really bright, distinctive red. And again, you can see the pollen presenters here. When the flower is fully open, when the flowers are fully open, you can see all of the pollen presenters here. So you can see them all here. And so that's kind of the stages of the Banksia. And for many Proteaceae as well, they kind of do this really weird thing. Lastly, the other family that I want to show you, actually, there's two really major families in Australia, the Proteaceae and the Myrtaceae. there are lots of Myrtaceae growing in the Bay Area. The eucalypts that grow everywhere are part of the Myrtaceae family. You may know them as the New Zealand Christmas tree that are really common in street trees in San Francisco. I saw one today and it has just started blooming. So keep an eye out for a plant that has these red flowers. Another plant that I saw in San Francisco, I think this was Coal Valley, I can't remember, but this is what we call a melaleuca or a paper bark. Actually, you can actually peel some of the papery layers of the bark. And when I was a kid, we used to peel it off the tree in front of my cousin's house and actually ride on them. And so these are common also in San Francisco as street trees. And then the final one is a wreath that I made during a workshop last year, an online workshop last year at SFBG. And so here, what you can see, actually you can see some Proteaceae over here. Here you can see a leucodendron, and I wanted to put the eucalyptus. Of course, I personalised this because I had the eucalyptus as the sort of centre of this wreath, this Christmas wreath. And so in terms of the flowers can either be individual, sort of one by themselves, or aggregated into a structure. And you'll see what I mean by that in a minute. In almost all of the Myrtaceae, it's the stamens, the male parts, that are the really most obvious part. And this family grows particularly in Australia, but it also extends into Asia, so even as far as the Philippines. It's found in South America, and there are fossils of eucalyptus that have been found in South America. And there's also plants that are elsewhere in the Southern Hemisphere. One of the plants that I wanted to introduce you to, and I didn't have this in the slides, is callistemon, and what we call the bottle brush. And I'll explain why we call that the bottle brush in the next slide. And so what you have is the stamens, and you can see how prominent the stamens are. So you have the anther at the top where the pollen is, and that's the filament. The petals are really, really reduced. That's the technical term that we use. So basically the petals are really tiny. You'll have the style and the stigma that sticks out. Oftentimes you probably won't see it. It's a bit hard to see. And then we have at the base of the style, we'll have the ovary where the eggs are. And so what this represents is if we chopped a flower vertically in half. And so bottle brush flowers, so you can see individually, here's one flower, and they're all aggregated into this structure. And again, you can see the individual stamens, so that each filament, and you can see the anther at the top. And so, as I said, it's largely the stamens that form the kind of showiness of Myrtaceae. And so it's not the petals that we kind of expect to be showy in most plants. And this can kind of give you an idea of why we call it the bottle brush. And so we have, especially the image on the right, if you think of the bottle brush that you use to clean bottles, this is exactly what this is pretty much what it looks like. So that's why we have it that common name. On the left, you can see these really reduced petals, and here are the stamens again. Last flower, of course, I wanted to tell you about, and its structure is eucalyptus, and it's grown as street trees. There are weeds here. I can see Sutro Tower and all the eucalypts from my place. And so I wanted to show you what the eucalyptus flower actually consists of. And so we have, again, you can see the male flower, the male parts. So the filament and the anther, which is collectively called the stamen. And then these are called staminodes. So these are filaments without the anther. Again, the stigma and the style are really reduced. They're kind of hidden by the stamens. and then they go down to the ovary, and that's what you can see down there. And so here's an image of what half of a eucalyptus flower looks like. It's been dissected. You can see all the stamens, and here's the female structure. So the stigma and the style. And so as you're walking around the streets of San Francisco, the Bay Area, wherever you're dialing in from, keep an eye out for the eucalyptus, and you can see exactly what they look like. These are the buds of eucalyptus, and here what you can see is the technical term is the operculum. And this operculum I like to think of as a hat. And so it protects the flower as it's growing. So it protects the bud. And then, once the flower is mature and the stamens are ready to pop out, this little hat is going to pop off. So you can see it's like just about to be ready to pop off because the stamens are here. And then all the stamens will kind of explode out. And then the next stage is eucalyptus fruits. And as botanists, anything that produces seeds and then becomes a fruit. So it doesn't have to be fleshy like the fruits that we eat, like the apples and bananas. We have very woody fruits in Australia, again, adapted to bushfires. And so what you can see here is a eucalyptus fruit, and this has a little opening here for the seeds to be released. Again, some fire will help in some cases to release the seeds. And this sort of shows you the buds again. So you have the bud and the operculum, so the little hat. And so with that, I want to remind you to come and see all of these plants in person. And so even though you can't go to Australia right now, what you can do is take your own trip to the Botanical Garden and see all of these beauties and enjoy them as well. So not only the Australia section of the Botanical Garden, but also the South African section as well has a lot of these plants. And also I want to remind you to come and visit the Conservatory of Flowers, which also has Australian plants, but mostly tropical plants, so not the Sydney plants. And so I would like to thank all of you for joining me this evening. I hope you enjoyed the visual beauty of all these different coloured flowers and plants. Thank SFBG and the Conservatory of Flowers. Thank Tori Stewart from SFBG for providing me with many of the pictures that I used today of the San Francisco Botanical Garden. And the textbook that I used was called Name That Flower by Clark and Lee, just in case you're interested. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I don't think that I knew the detail of the Proteaceae structure, and it was really interesting how those parts unfurl. I really never understood that. So you really helped clear that up for me. And I know that from the chat that there are some of our attendees who also were a little mind blown about all of that. So thank you. I feel like I'm walking away with some rich new information. I do have, let's see, a question by chat, and the question was about a source for bulbs or seeds, I presume of Australian plants in the USA. Do you happen to have any idea about that?
I have no idea. I don't know. I haven't tried to grow Australian plants here. I'm actually a terrible gardener, so I have no idea.
We do have a lot of plants because it's such a popular plant in the Bay Area, because our climate is so perfect for growing them. We do have a good array of Proteaceae family plants in our plant arbor, which is open every day at the garden. So it's always nice to go check that out. There's always some leucospermum or leucodendron in there. And those, you aren't starting from seed. They're already nicely grown up for you and ready to plant in your yard. I have another question on chat about the garden and its cycads. And maybe you know more about the garden cycads. Natalie, do you have anywhere to point these folks in particular? I imagine they
Yeah,
garden.
definitely. So if you head to the ancient plant garden where there's a boardwalk, there are many cycads in there and a bunch of different species as well inside the boardwalk. And so the thing with the boardwalk is that, you have kind of the early plants, which don't include cycads, but include things like ferns and lycopods, so spore-bearing plants. And then you keep walking and you see the gymnosperms. So these are plants that don't have flowers but have seeds. And so those include things like conifers and ginkgo, and you'll see many, many cycads in that section. And also if you just walk a little bit prior to entering the ancient plant garden, you'll find a bunch of cycads as well.
Great. I have another question in chat, and it reads, did the original native people of Australia practice controlled burning, which helped to maintain the native plants? As an example, those that required fire to open the seeds.
Yeah, so a lot of the Australian flora is adapted to fire because the Australian Aborigines did have controlled burns. And they used it in a variety of ways. They used it to control the bushland, and they also used it to actually sort of get the animals out of the land, and so they could kind of hunt when there was a bushfire. They really, this is like a whole sort of subject in itself, but they really had a deep connection with the land. And I think we're only really, people are only really starting to realize now how deep that connection was. They farmed the land as well. And, people just thought that they were kind of, sort of living off the land, but they actually actively cultivated the land and looked after the land. And so, we really don't understand much. And so we really have a lot more to learn.
Great. All right. Well, those were our main questions. Does anyone else have anything more that you would like to add or ask of Natalie before we wrap up this evening? Last chance for questions. Or you could drop into chat what your favorite slide was or your favorite learning. I see that many of you really appreciated the presentation tonight. Thank you for sharing that. All right, question in chat. Are there grasslands in Australia? Yeah, there are grasslands. And so, in the outback, there's lots of grasses, different grasses. There are other plants that grow with it. And just sort of there's eucalypt grasslands, and that's where cycads grow. So I sort of go around those areas as well. And so there's grasses and tall eucalypt trees as well. So we do have grasslands, kind of different to over here because the grasslands are really, really dry. Great. Gus, we have some definite love for Banksias in our attendees today. I think we can all agree on that. Also appreciation for the pea plant, and also the deeper dive on Banksia structure. So thank you so much on behalf of our audience as well and myself. Great. Is there anything that you would leave us with before Sarah wraps it up for us this evening? I would just like to say thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and make sure you go and visit the garden and see all these structures for yourself. Fantastic. Thank you so much. This will wrap up our, oh, wait, there's one more question. We're going to get to it. All right, another question is, you had an image of the white orchid, which seemed to be growing in areas with eucalyptus leaves. I thought that the eucalyptus keep most plants from growing under them due to the allelochemicals, am I saying that right, in the leaves. How is that happening?
Yeah, so it's, if you think of the Australian flora, it's completely adapted to eucalypts. They have evolved alongside eucalypts, and so those plants can grow totally fine. It's only over here that we don't have plants that are adapted to the eucalypts, and so they, you know, there's just nothing growing there. We have kind of a similar sort of an analogous system where we have pines growing in Australia, and you know, the pine needles fall down and nothing is able to grow over there. And so it's really interesting because you see the pines over here and it's a complete forest and there's like all these different plants in there. But in Australia, you know, it's kind of barren, completely like the eucalypt forest over here.
Wow, that's fascinating. All right. Well, thank you all. I'm going to toss it to Sarah to wrap us up tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And thank you to Natalie and Jessa. It was wonderful doing this presentation with both of you. And thank you all who attended tonight and for bringing some really great questions to bring some conversation to the end here. It was wonderful to have this collaboration between several different organizations here in Golden Gate Park. So glad to have the SF Botanical Garden and Cal Academy and the Conservatory all represented here, and we're all three open to visit. So we hope to see you in person in the near future, and also look out for some upcoming events, hopefully like maybe more virtual events like this one, or perhaps in person now as a possibility. So we look forward to seeing you here, there, everywhere, and have a wonderful evening. And thanks again, Natalie, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you and good night, everybody.